is the single greatest energy system in the Western psyche. In our culture, it has supplanted religion as the arena in which men and women seek meaning, transcendence, wholeness, and ecstasy. As a mass phenomenon, romantic love is peculiar to the West. In Eastern cultures, we find that married couples love each other with great warmth, often with a stability and devotion that puts us to shame. But their love is not romantic love as we know it. They don't impose the same ideals on their relationships, nor do they impose such impossible demands and expectations on one another as we do. Romantic love is not just a form of love. It is a whole psychological package, a combination of beliefs, attitudes, and expectations. These often contradictory ideas coexist in our unconscious minds and dominate our reactions and behavior without our being aware of them. We have automatic assumptions about what a relationship with another person is, what we should feel, and what we should get out of it. For romantic love just doesn't mean loving someone, it means being in love. When we are in love, we believe we have found the ultimate meaning of life, revealed in another human being. We feel we are finally completed, that we have found the missing parts of ourselves. Life suddenly seems to have a wholeness, a superhuman intensity that lifts us high above the ordinary plane of existence. For us, these are the sure signs of true love. The psychological package includes an unconscious demand that our lover or spouse always provide us with this feeling of ecstasy and intensity. Despite our ecstasy when we are in love, we spend much of our time with a deep sense of loneliness, alienation, and frustration over our inability to make genuinely loving and committed relationships. Usually we blame other people for failing us. It doesn't occur to us that perhaps it is we who need to change our own unconscious attitudes, the expectations and demands we impose on our relationships, and on other people. This is the great wound in the Western psyche. It is the primary psychological problem of our Western culture. Carl Jung said that if you find the psychic wound in an individual or a people, there you find also their path to consciousness. If Westerners will free themselves from their unconscious assumptions and expectations of romantic love, they will not only find a new awareness in their relationships, but a new awareness of their own selves. Romantic love has existed throughout history in many cultures. We find it in the literature of ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, ancient Persia, and feudal Japan. But our modern Western society is the only culture in history that has experienced romantic love as a mass phenomenon. We are the only society that makes romance the basis of our marriages and love relationships and the cultural ideal of true love. The ideal of romantic love burst into Western society during the Middle Ages. It first appeared in our literature in the myth of Tristan and Isolde, then in the love songs of the troubadours. It was called courtly love. Its model was the brave knight who worshipped a fair lady as his inspiration, the symbol of all beauty and perfection, the ideal that moved him to be noble, spiritual, refined, and high-minded. In our time, we have mixed courtly love into our sexual relationships and marriages, but we still hold the medieval belief that true love has to be the ecstatic adoration of a man or woman who carries, for us, the image of perfection. Carl Jung has shown us that when a great psychological phenomenon suddenly appears in the life of an individual, it represents a tremendous unconscious potential that is rising to the level of consciousness. The same is true for a culture. At a certain point in the history of a people, a new possibility bursts out of the collective unconscious. It is a new idea, a new belief, a new value, or a new way of looking at the universe. It represents a potential good if it can be integrated into consciousness. But at first, it is overwhelming, even destructive. Romantic love is one of these truly overwhelming psychological phenomena that have appeared in Western history. It has overwhelmed our collective psyche and permanently altered our view of the world. But if men and women will understand the psychological dynamics behind romantic love and learn to handle them consciously, they will find a new possibility of relationship, both to themselves and to others. Our vehicle for exploring romantic love is the myth of Tristan and Isolde. It is one of the most moving, beautiful, and tragic of all the great epic tales. It was the first story in Western literature that dealt with romantic love. It is the source from which all of our romantic literature has sprung, from Romeo and Juliet down to the love story in the movie at the local cinema. By applying the principles of Jungian psychology, we will interpret the symbols in the myth and learn what it has to teach us about the origins, the nature, and the meaning of romantic love. The myth of Tristan and Isolde portrays the life of young Tristan, who grows into a noble and selfless hero and then meets the overwhelming experience of his life in his passion for Queen Isolde. It vividly pictures the development of an individual male consciousness as he struggles to win his masculinity, to become conscious of his feminine side, and to deal with love and relatedness. The myth not only records the dynamics of romantic love in the male psyche, it also reflects the fate of the feminine in our culture. It shows how the feminine values of feeling, relatedness, and soul consciousness have been virtually driven out of our culture by our patriarchal mentality. One of the most important insights in the myth for women is the degree to which men unconsciously search for their lost feminine side, for the feminine values in life, and attempt to find their unlived feminine side through women. But it is not only men who have accepted the patriarchal version of reality. Women also have been taught to idealize masculine values at the expense of the feminine side of life. Women have been trained that only masculine activities, power, and achieving have any real value. Thus, Western woman finds herself in the same psychological dilemma as Western man, developing her masculine qualities at the expense of her feminine side. Although this mythical evocation of romantic love is told from a man's viewpoint and seen through a man's eyes, women will find much of their own experience in it. But the psychological makeups of men and women are distinct. If we tried fully to explain a woman's psychology through a man's myth, it would give a distorted view of her structure. This is especially true in romantic love, for a woman's feeling side develops differently than a man's, and her experience of relationship has subtle nuances that men do not experience in the same way. For both men and women to look honestly at romantic love is a heroic journey. It forces us to look not only at the beauty and potential in romantic love, but also at the contradictions and illusions we carry around inside us at the unconscious level. Heroic journeys always lead through dark valleys and difficult confrontations. But if we persevere, we find a new possibility of consciousness. The story you are about to hear is one of the great myths of all time. It has the dignity and power of Gilgamesh, Beowulf, or the Icelandic sagas. Such myths have an uncanny power to thrill us and transport us to the realm of magic, noble deeds, and unearthly passion. But a myth does more than that. If we learn to listen, it also teaches us deep truths of the psyche. A myth is not true in the outer physical sense, but it is an accurate expression of a psychological situation. Myths are like dreams. Dreams are the messengers of the unconscious mind. Through them, the unconscious communicates its contents and its concerns to the conscious mind. By learning the symbolic language of dreams, a person learns to see what is going on at an unconscious level and even discovers what needs to be done about it. Jung demonstrated that myths also are symbolic expressions of the unconscious. But though a dream expresses the dynamics within an individual, a myth expresses the dynamics within the collective mind of a society, culture, or race. A myth is the collective dream of an entire people at a certain point in their history. It is as though the entire population dreamed together, and that dream, the myth, burst forth through its poetry, songs, and stories. But a myth not only lives in literature and imagination, it immediately finds its way into the behavior and attitudes of the culture, into the practical daily lives of the people. The myth of Tristan and Isolde is a profound expression of the Western psyche. It is a vivid, panoramic view of the psychological forces at work in the unconscious of Western people for the last 1,000 years of our history. Above all, this myth gives us a painfully accurate picture of romantic love, why it came into our culture, what it is, and why it isn't working very well. Our myth shows us that romantic love is a necessary ingredient in the evolution of the Western psyche. We will achieve wholeness, and we will move on to the next step in our evolution of consciousness only when we learn to live consciously with romantic love. That is, with the vast psychological forces that it represents. After many years of living in the rich world of the psyche and learning its laws, Carl Jung saw a vast evolutional power at work in the psychic universe. He saw that the human psyche strives always towards wholeness, strives to complete itself and become more conscious. Each person's psyche has an inborn evolutional urge to grow, to integrate the contents of the unconscious, to bring together all the missing parts of the total individual into a complete, whole, and conscious self. Jung teaches us that the unconscious is the source, the primal matter from which our conscious minds and ego personalities have evolved. All the values, ideas, feelings, capacities, and attitudes that we have developed into functioning parts of our conscious personalities originated in the raw, primal material of the unconscious. To get a clear image of this, we may picture a coral island that gradually rises out of the sea. The ocean slowly creates this island out of its own matter and pushes it above the water into the sunlight. After centuries, topsoil and plant life develop, animals and people appear, and the little island becomes a tiny center of human life and consciousness. Like the vast ocean, the collective unconscious gives birth to a tiny island. It is the conscious psyche, the ego, the I, the part of me that is aware of itself. This little ego mind, surrounded by the vastness of the unconscious, has a high and noble task, a special destiny to live out. Its role in this evolution is to integrate more and more of the unconscious until the conscious mind truly reflects the wholeness of the self. All humankind is in the grip of this huge evolutional power. When the collective unconscious begins a new stage in this process, it tolerates no obstacle. In order to force a new ideal of possibility into the conscious psyche of a people, it will turn a society upside down, launch crusades, beget new religions, or shake empires into rubble. The appearance of romantic love in the West began a momentous chapter in this cosmic drama of evolution. Romantic love is the mask behind which a powerful array of new possibility hides, waiting to be integrated into consciousness. But what has begun as a huge collective surge of psychic energy must be perfected at the individual level. It is up to us as individuals to take this raw, unconscious energy, this confusing array of impulses and possibilities, and transform it into awareness and relatedness. Every great myth is the symbolic record of such a stage of growth in the life of a people. Tristan and Isolde is a symbolic blueprint of our Western psyche at a critical turning point in our psychological development. As you now listen to the myth, it shows us the conflict and illusions, but also the potentialities inherent in romantic love.
Long ago, in the days of King Arthur, Mark was king in Cornwall. Now Mark was a fair and good king, and all his subjects loved him for his justice and kindness. But those were evil times, for cruel enemies surrounded Mark and invaded his lands. But good King Revelin of Lyonesse brought his army across from France, and by his help, King Mark won a great victory. So grateful was he that he gave his only sister, Blanchefleur, to be wed to King Revelin in token of eternal friendship and alliance. Blanchefleur was like her name, which means white flower, delicate, fair, and pale. A royal wedding was held in Tintagel Castle, and there a baby was conceived. Before long came grim news. King Revelin's cities in Lyonesse were besieged by a treacherous tyrant, Duke Morgan. Revelin set sail with his new queen Blanchefleur and with his army, and returned to his land to do battle. But after months of war, poor King Revelin was caught in foul ambush and cruelly murdered by Morgan. When Blanchefleur heard, she grew pallid and faint, and her life flowed out of her. She had no more desire to live on earth, but only longed to join her husband in the other world. Yet she was heavy with child. She abided 3 days in sorrow and longing for death. And on the 4th day she brought forth a child, and said, "Little son, I have longed a while to see you, the fairest thing ever a woman bore. In sadness came I hither, in sadness did I bring forth. In sadness has your first feast day gone. And as by sadness you came into the world, your name shall be called Tristan, that is, the child of sadness." Thus did she name her child, and kissed him, and then she died. Now Lord Roholt was the faithful marshal of King Revelin, and when he saw the war was lost, he surrendered the castles to Duke Morgan, and all the land of Lyonesse came under tyranny. But Roholt hid the baby Tristan among his own sons, lest the wicked Duke Morgan murder the child. Tristan grew fair and strong among the sons of Roholt, but he did not know who he was, believing Roholt to be his own father. As he grew, his faithful squire taught him all the arts of barony. Tristan rode as though he and his horse were one. He was loyal and brave, although only a boy, and he wielded his sword like a full-grown knight. One day, Norwegian pirates, posing as merchants, lured Tristan aboard their ship. Though the boy fought like a lion cub, the pirates captured and bound him, for they could sell so fine a youth in servitude in some distant land. But a terrible storm blew, and great waves poured over the decks. The felons knew the gods of the ocean were angered by their crime, so they put Tristan into a boat and set him free. Instantly the waves calmed. Ahead, Tristan saw land, and he gratefully pulled for shore. They were the fair green shores of Cornwall, where his uncle, King Mark, still ruled. By chance, the king's huntsmen were by the shore, and Tristan so pleased them by his skill that they took him to the court of the king. When Mark gazed on Tristan, he was troubled and filled with tenderness, and knew not why. For in Tristan he saw the face of his beloved sister, Blanchefleur, and her blood called out to him. After the evening meal, Tristan took up a harp and sang the old songs. Then every heart was lifted and every eye filled with tears. And King Mark said, "Son, blessed be the master that taught thee, and blessed be thou of God. For God loves good singers. For our joy did you come to this roof. Stay near us a long time, friend." And Tristan answered, "Here I will stay, my lord, and serve you faithfully as your liege." For 3 years Tristan lived in Tintagel Castle, and the king was as father to him, and a deep love grew between them. When 3 years had passed, the faithful Marshal Roholt came to Cornwall, for he had searched for Tristan in many lands. Thus Tristan found out who he was, the nephew of King Mark, the son of King Revelin, the heir to the throne of Lyonesse. Then, with a company of knights, Tristan crossed the waters to Lyonesse and razed the countryside, and the people rose against the tyrant Morgan. Tristan met the traitor on the field of combat and slew him with a sword. Then Tristan put Roholt on the throne of Lyonesse and said to his barons, "Here I am king, and this land is dear, but my heart is with my uncle, good King Mark. Now I give you my faithful Roholt to rule you in my stead, for I must go to Mark and serve him." Now in those days Ireland was a mighty kingdom, and the Irish king taxed Cornwall for a terrible tribute. Every 4th year, the Cornish people had to send 300 youths and 300 maidens of their sons and daughters to serve as slaves and die in Ireland. But for 15 years, King Mark had refused to pay the tribute, and the Irish king was wrathful. The queen in Ireland was a great sorceress, and her brother was a giant called the Morholt. So tall and strong was he that 5 knights together could not overcome him. One sad day, the Morholt landed in Cornwall with many knights and demanded the tribute of youths and maidens. "But," said he, "if any knight in Cornwall will fight me, then will we have a trial by combat to see if the King of Ireland receives his tribute without cause. For God will give me the victory if my Irish king is in the right." The Morholt stood before all the barons in the king's court and offered combat. But the Cornish barons shivered and hid their heads. On the 3rd day, a young boy stood forth, and kneeling before the king said, "My lord, let me do battle." And that boy was Tristan. Tristan fought the Morholt on a tiny islet off the shore. At the battleground, he jumped from his boat, and then he turned and pushed his boat adrift. The Morholt was surprised, but Tristan said, "One of us only will go hence alive. One boat will serve." At noontime, the people saw the Morholt's boat returning from the islet. Then truly they lost hope and wept in despair. But as the boat approached, they saw Tristan standing in the bow. The young men jumped into the water in their joy and swam out to meet him. When they had pulled his boat in, Tristan said to the Morholt's knights, "My lords of Ireland, the Morholt fought well. See here, my sword is broken, and a splinter of it stands fast in his head. Take you that steel, my lords. It is the tribute of Cornwall." Then Tristan walked to the castle, blood flowing from his wounds. There he fell in the arms of King Mark and fainted. Tristan's wounds grew worse and worse, for the Morholt had pierced him with a poisoned barb. He turned pale, and his body wasted. Neither doctor nor magician could they find to heal him. For that poison, only the sorceress queen of Ireland and her daughter, Iseult the Fair, had the secret charms of healing. But those 2 magical women were in Ireland, where they watched over the body of the Morholt. Day and night they cursed the name of Tristan of Lyonesse and thirsted for revenge. Now Tristan's heart told him to go to sea and seek there either healing or death. So they laid him gently in a small boat, without sail or oars. He left his sword on the shore, for it could no longer help him. But he took his harp into the boat for comfort on the way. Then they pushed him out to sea and committed him to God, and the sea drew him away. For 7 days and 7 nights Tristan lay upon the waters, and then he drew near a shore. At dawn some fishermen found him, senseless in his boat, his hand resting on his harp. They took Tristan ashore and carried him to their lady, Iseult the Fair. Of all the women in the world, she alone could heal him, but it was she who most wished him dead.
At the beginning of this myth, we find a hero born in sadness, his mother lost on the first day of his life. Who is this child, and what does Blanchefleur's death mean for us? The loss of Tristan's mother is not his experience alone, for Tristan is a prototype, the firstborn of our modern race. Psychologically, our modern era began in the 12th century, the time when Tristan was born and this myth came to life. The seeds of our modern mind were planted in that time. What we are today, our attitudes, values, conflicts, and ideals, has grown from those seeds. Tristan is the new child born in the Middle Ages who grew up over a millennium to be modern Western man. His mother and father, Blanchefleur and King Richard, symbolize the old order, the ancient mind of Europe. Blanchefleur's death leaves Tristan in a sadly distorted world, bereft of almost all traces of the feminine. She personifies the inner feminine soul of Western man, the feminine values that once lived in our culture. Her death records that sad day in our history when our patriarchal mentality finally drove the feminine out of our culture and out of our individual lives. Tristan is raised to the arts of barony. Everything in his world emphasizes the masculine side of life, wielding power, training for battle, defending territory. King Mark has no queen. His sister Blanchefleur has died. The whole feminine side of life, love, feeling relationship, introspection, the intuitive and lyrical experience of life, has all but disappeared from Cornwall and Lyonesse. The only remnant of the feminine left to Tristan is his harp, and as we shall see, it is his harp that saves him. We will understand our story better if we get a clear idea of what we mean by the feminine. Jung found that the psyche is androgynous. It is made up of both masculine and feminine components. Thus, every man and every woman has a psychological structure that in its wholeness includes the richness of both sides. The psyche divides itself into complementary opposites and represents them as a masculine-feminine constellation. It characterizes some qualities as being masculine and certain others as being feminine. These opposites balance and complete each other. The psyche sees our capacity for relatedness and love as emanating from the feminine side of the psyche. It views the ability to wield power, control situations, and defend territory as strengths that we find in the masculine department of the psyche. To become a complete man or woman, each of us must develop both sides of the psyche. When a man develops the strengths of his inner feminine, it actually completes his maleness. He becomes more fully male as he becomes more fully human. His masculine strength is augmented and balanced by his feminine capacity to be related, to express his affection and his feelings. In each of us there is a potential for wholeness, for bringing the conflicting parts of ourselves together in a synthesis. Jung called this totality of the individual the self. The self is the sum of all the divergent forces, energies, and qualities that live within you and make you who you are. The self is the balanced unity at the very center of one's being. But we rarely experience the self with our conscious mind. We rarely have that sense of unity and wholeness. We feel ourselves usually as a chaotic mass of conflicting desires, values, ideals, and possibilities, some conscious and some unconscious, pulling us in many directions at once. The work of enlightenment is to make conscious these divided and conflicting parts of ourselves. In mythical symbolism, the self is often represented by a masculine-feminine pair, a king and queen, a divine brother and sister, a god and goddess. Through this symbol of the royal couple, the psyche tells us that we must make a marriage between the two great polarities of our human nature. It is the feminine qualities that bring meaning into life, relatedness to other human beings, the ability to soften power with love, awareness of our inner feelings and values, respect for our earthly environment, a delight in Earth's beauty, and the introspective quest for inner wisdom. Why did Blanchefleur die? Why have we Western people lost so much of our capacity to love, to feel, and to be related? Look at Blanchefleur. She is surrounded by war, married to an ally for help in a war, rushed to another war that kills her husband. She knows only soldiers, battles, alliances, and death. When Blanchefleur died that cold day in Lyonesse, the feminine soul of the West departed. But her death does not mean that we have lost these qualities forever. Death in a myth or dream means something has left the conscious mind. Blanchefleur went to live in the unconscious, to await a better time when she will return to human life. Like Tristan, we are the children of sadness. Probably no other people in history have been so lonely, so alienated, so confused over values, so neurotic. We have dominated our environment and amassed riches on an unprecedented scale. But few of us are at peace with ourselves, secure in our relationships, content in our loves, or at home in the world. Most of us cry out for meaning in life, for values we can live by, for love and relationship. Our sadness results from the loss of those feminine values that we have driven out of our culture. Blanche Fleur could not survive in a culture that only honors acquisition, power, and competition. King Revelin's marriage with Blanche Fleur symbolizes our Western attempt to make a synthesis within the patriarchal mentality. But it can't survive, for it is based on our assumption that feminine values must always be subservient to masculine demands for power. Though Mark loves his sister, he trades her off to Revelin for help in defending his territory. She is a piece of property, to be used as the masculine ego sees fit in the service of its power drive. Duke Morgan represents the ultimate extreme of the patriarchal mentality. He builds nothing positive, he only plunders. He is a power drive gone mad without the balancing force of love, feeling, and human values. In our own time, we do not have to look far to find Duke Morgan. We find him running governments, corporations, even households. If we look honestly, we find traces of him within ourselves. We spend our days thinking only of how to get ahead, how to win, how to find a better position in business and society, how to make our families and friends do exactly what we want them to do. The specter of Duke Morgan wakens us to a profound psychological reality. If the masculine mind tries to live without its other half, the feminine soul, then the masculine becomes unbalanced, sick, and finally monstrous. But the unconscious will not tolerate this kind of imbalance. The greatest force in the psychic universe is the demand for wholeness. The feminine will return. Across the seas, Iseult is waiting. And when she comes, the self-satisfied patriarchal world will never be the same. For all humankind and through all ages, the sea has been the great symbol of the unconscious. Exotic kingdoms and distant lands across the sea have always represented the great unknown. Our longing for these places has a deep inner meaning. It is our longing for the mysterious, unexplored depths of our own psyches. In Tristan's time, the world was small. The exotic, unknown land across the sea was Ireland, with a sorceress queen, a magical princess, dragons, and giants. Cornwall is the island of the ego, dominated by the patriarchal masculine attitude. Ireland is the island of the unconscious matriarchal feminine. Neither can live without its complementary opposite. The unconscious pulls Tristan toward Ireland, for he is the hero who must pull the islands together. Even the pirates are in the service of this evolution. The disasters of life are often the genius of the unconscious, forcing our egos into a new experience of the self. There is a fight between Cornwall and Ireland, for the inner attempt at synthesis always begins with conflict. When we first hear of Ireland, we hear of a terrible tribute, 300 youths and 300 maidens. What does this mean? When we refuse to integrate a powerful new potentiality from the unconscious will exact a tribute in one way or another. The tribute may take the form of a neurosis, a compulsive mood, hypochondria, obsessions, or a paralyzing depression. If we deny our feminine side, we may try to live it out in compulsive, unconscious ways. We may eat and drink too much, become moody, have headaches. If we learn to live the feminine in a more conscious way, we could make peace with ourselves. But we can't do this by sitting rooted in our patriarchal attitudes, secure in Cornwall. We have to go to the parts of ourselves that we barely know. We must sail forth on the deep waters, risking all, steering for Ireland. The job of the hero is specific: to undertake the journey, to face the dragons and giants there, and to find the hidden treasure. Two things are required for a hero: a sword and a harp. The sword symbolizes the sharp, aggressive wielding of masculine power. the discriminating intellect that divides and analyzes, the logical, critical faculty in the mind. The harp represents the power to develop a sense of values, to affirm what is good and true, to appreciate beauty. It is the harp that enables us to journey on the seas of the unconscious. The harp is the lyrical feeling side of the psyche. It was with the harp that Tristan awakened the love between him and his uncle. When he heard the harp, King Mark cried, "For our joy did you come to this roof? Stay near us a long time, friend." It is the harp that accompanies Tristan on his journey across the waters. But first, it is necessary for him to defeat the Morholt with the sword. For the Morholt represents the terrible force that the unconscious feminine unleashes against the masculine ego that tries to shut her out. The primitive, raw power of the unconscious feminine demands absolute control over a man's life. That would be an extreme swing from the one-sided patriarchal attitude to an equally unbalanced feminine attitude, an enslavement to the opposite pole of domination by the feminine. A great paradox is laid out before us at this point in our story. Before a masculine ego makes peace with the feminine, it must first develop enough strength to approach the powerful inner feminine on equal terms. The ego thus has a vital role to play in the great drama of evolving consciousness. The ego has the task of going to the inner Ireland, of making a synthesis among the different centers of consciousness within the vast universe of the psyche. Tristan achieves a wonderful victory over the Morholt, but in the process he is wounded by a poisonous barb. The poison barb shows us that there is no final victory over the inner feminine. In every victory, there is a poison barb. This is what forces a man finally to drop his arrogance and go voluntarily to the feminine. Without the barb, Tristan would have stayed in the patriarchal mentality of Cornwall and never thought of approaching the feminine again. There comes a time in life when a man's ego doesn't have the answers. He doesn't have the resources needed to resolve an impossible situation. No one in Cornwall could heal Tristan's illness. At such times, a man must relinquish control. Tristan shows us how. He lays aside his sword, puts himself in a boat without sail or oar, takes only his harp, and casts himself adrift on the sea. One of the great strengths of the inner feminine is the ability to let go, to give up ego control, to stop trying to control the people and the situation, and to wait on the natural flow of the universe. And so Tristan is cast upon the sea, drawn by a power that is high above the understanding of his ego. With no chart to guide him, he comes at last to Ireland.
When the fishermen found Tristan adrift in his boat, they pulled him into shore and carried him to the palace of Iseult the Fair. Iseult and her mother applied secret herbs, potions, and spells. In time, Tristan felt healing course through his body. So changed was he by his illness that none of the Morholt's knights knew him, and as soon as he had the strength, he stole away, found passage across the waters, and returned to Cornwall, where the king and the court received him with astonished joy. But Tristan had enemies in Cornwall. 4 felon barons envied and hated him, and went among the other barons and said, "Tristan must be a sorcerer, else how could he have defeated the giant, and cured himself of that poison, and returned from sure death on the sea? If he becomes king, we will hold our lands of a warlock." So all the barons came before King Mark and said he must take a queen and produce an heir of his body, else they would all rise in rebellion. One day, 2 sparrows flew in a castle window and dropped a woman's golden hair onto the king's hand. Then Mark called the barons together and said he would have for his queen only the damsel of that golden hair, for he hoped thereby to put off the barons' demands. But Tristan was shamed, and to prove he did not covet the throne, stood forth and vowed to find the lady with the hair of gold, or to die in the attempt. No one knew that when he saw the strand of hair, he remembered Iseult the Fair, and knew that the hair was hers. Tristan made ready his ship and sailed to Ireland. There he pretended to be a merchant and awaited his chance to win the Princess Iseult. Then one day came the roaring of a terrible dragon ravaging the countryside, and the King of Ireland offered his daughter, Iseult, to marry the knight who defeated the dragon. When Tristan heard this, he swiftly put on armor, mounted his stallion, and went to fight. The dragon was so fierce that Tristan's lance broke against it, and his horse was killed by the dragon's fiery breath. But Tristan plunged his sword deep into the soft underthroat, and the monster fell dead. Tristan was found there, wounded and poisoned, so once again Iseult nursed him back from the edge of death. One day she began to clean his sword. Then suddenly she saw a small notch in the blade. She went to find the splinter of steel that she had taken from the head of her uncle, the Morholt, and when she found that it fit into the notch in the sword, she lifted the sword against Tristan, crying, "You are that same Tristan, the murderer of my uncle." But Tristan spoke. "One day 2 swallows flew to Tinigel, bearing one of your hairs of gold, and I thought they brought me goodwill and peace, so I came to find you overseas. So I braved the monster and his poison. See here, amid the threads of gold upon my coat, your hair is sewn." When Iseult heard these words, she lowered the sword and went to look upon his coat. There she found her own hair of gold. She was silent. Then she kissed him on the lips. A few days hence, Tristan stood before the king and revealed who he was. He said that he slew the dragon to pay a blood fine for the Morholt, and offered that Iseult be King Mark's bride, and that there be peace between the 2 kingdoms. The king was glad to hear this, but Iseult trembled for shame and anguish to learn that Tristan had come seeking her not for himself, but for his king. The sorceress queen now gathered flowers and herbs and roots. She steeped them in wine, and over that potion cast a magic spell, and this was its power. They who drank of it together should love each other with their every sense and thought, but after 3 years its power would wane. Then she secretly gave it to Iseult's maid, and charged her to offer it only to King Mark and Iseult on the night of their wedding, after they were alone. The ship set sail for Cornwall, but the winds failed, and they dropped anchor by an island. Then Tristan heard Iseult weeping for her lost homeland. He sought to comfort her, but she turned her face from him. The day was hot, and he called for something to drink. A servant girl searched and found a pitcher of cool wine, and they drank deeply. Hours later, Iseult's maid found them still seated there, entranced and spellbound. Cold fear ran through her when she saw the pitcher set before them, for it was the magic potion. And the maid cried, "Now henceforth never shall you know joy without pain again, for through me and in that cup you have drunk not love alone, but love and death mixed together." But Tristan held Iseult, and a desire greater than mortal will worked in them, and he said, "Well then, let come death." The wind freshened, and the ship moved toward Cornwall, and all through the night they gave themselves up utterly to love.
When Tristan and Iseult drank the love potion, the cult of romance burst into our culture and began to form our modern ideas about love. Today, people describe almost any attraction between men and women as romantic love, from sexual desire to long-term commitment. We are so caught up in the belief that romantic love is true love that we use the term for many things that are not romantic love at all. Our confusion in language tells us we have lost the consciousness of what love is, what romance is, and what the differences are between them. We are confusing 2 great psychological systems, and this has a devastating effect on our relationships. In our culture, we have romance in abundance. We fall in and out of love repeatedly. But if we look at our lives and the people around us, we see that romance doesn't necessarily translate into love or relatedness or commitment. Romance is something distinct, a reality unto itself. Romantic love is not love, but a complex of ideas about love. Romantic love was born into our society during the 12th century. the time of the origin of the Tristan myth. This cultural phenomenon was then known as courtesia, or courtly love. Courtly love was based on a completely new idea of love and relationship, for it idealized a spiritual relationship between men and women. Influenced by certain religious ideas of that era, it acted as an antidote to a patriarchal society by idealizing the feminine. Under the laws of courtly love, each knight agreed to obey his lady in all things having to do with love, relationship, manners, and taste. There are 3 characteristics of this arrangement that will help us to understand it. First, the knight and his lady were never to be involved sexually with each other. Theirs was an idealized, spiritualized relationship designed to lift them above the level of physicality. The second requirement of courtly love was that they not be married to each other. In fact, the lady was usually married to another nobleman. To her knight, she was a divinity, not an ordinary mortal woman, but a symbol of the eternal feminine. The third requirement was that the courtly lovers keep themselves aflame with passion while striving to see each other as a symbol of the divine archetypal world. This ideal so caught the Western imagination that it became the force behind a flow of poetry, songs, love stories, and plays. The love stories were called in French romans, which was anglicized into romance. These romances formed the basis for our romantic literature. Our ideal of the romantic has come down to us through these 12th century stories. Romantic love is storybook love, a story that we try to live out in the real world. Despite the cultural changes over the centuries, we seek the same patterns in our relationships. A woman who is more than a mere woman, the symbol of something so perfect that she inspires a sense of worship. We seek the spiritual intensity of the romances, the ecstasy and the despair and the drama. And we feel, like the knights of old, that all this uplifts us and gives life a new and special meaning. These inherited ideals cause us to seek passion and intensity for their own sake. They plant a perpetual discontent that can never find the perfection it seeks, and that blinds us to the delight and beauty of the here and now world. There is something awesome in these culturally transmitted systems of belief. One day we realize that we are dominated by a set of beliefs that we never chose. It is as though we breathed them from the air around us. We all know that we're supposed to fall in love, and that our relationships must be based on romance. Nothing less will do. Yet there is something real and true in romantic love. In its purest form, it is an ideal of great power, and contained within every such ideal is a profound reality. Our task is to find the truth in romantic love and the level on which this truth can live. One of the great needs of modern people is to learn the difference between human love as a basis for relationship and romantic love as a path to the inner world. The myth of Tristan can help us learn this difference by showing us how the 2 kinds of love are mixed. After Tristan and Isolde drank the magic potion, they are entranced, mesmerized, but with something separate and distinct from their human selves, something they see through the magic of the wine. Their love is not the ordinary human love that comes by knowing each other as individuals. This is a love that is magical, supernatural. It comes from outside the lovers and possesses them against their will. We know that there is something inexplicable in romance. When we look at the feelings that rampage through us, we know that it is not just companionship or sexual attraction, and not that quiet, devoted love we often see in stable marriages and relationships. It is something more. We seek in romantic love to be possessed by our love, to soar to the heights, to find ultimate meaning and fulfillment in our beloved. We seek the feeling of wholeness. If we ask where else we have looked for these things, there is a startling answer: religious experience. When we look for something greater than our egos, a sense of inner wholeness and unity, when we strive to rise above personal life to something extraordinary and limitless, this is a spiritual aspiration. We know that courtly love was originally conceived of as a spiritual love. Romantic love began as a path of spiritual love. Unconsciously, we seek that same path today. Here is the meaning of the magic potion in our story. There is another world outside the vision of our ego minds. It is the realm of the unconscious, where our souls and our spirits live. Everything that resides in the realm of the unconscious appears to the ego as being outside the natural human realm. Thus, it is magical, supernatural. The religious urge is a seeking after the totality of self, that which lives outside the ego's world in the unconscious. The troubadours and knights of Tristan's day were fully conscious of what they sought through romantic love. They gave up seeing woman as woman, and instead made her into a symbol of the eternal feminine, the soul, divine love, and wholeness. But modern Western man seeks a spiritual experience in romantic love without realizing it. We aren't consciously interested in wholeness, and we don't believe in the spirit. For lack of any other channel, our religious instinct has migrated almost completely into the area of romantic love. This is why we feel that our lives are meaningless except when we are in love, and why romantic love is the single greatest psychological force in our culture. Western men are taught that the male ego must have control over everything within and around it. The one power left that destroys our illusion of control, that forces a man to see that there is something beyond his understanding, is romantic love. Formal religion has long since ceased to threaten Western man's illusion of control. He seeks his soul not in religion or in spiritual experience or in his inner life, but he looks for that transcendence, that mystery, that revelation in woman. Carl Jung discovered that each human being has an inborn psychological urge to find a meaning in life. He saw that most Westerners, although they consciously only believe in what is physical and rational, have dreams and fantasies filled with symbols of a sense of wholeness and a vision of a world larger than the ego. We do not find our sense of meaning, wholeness, or fulfillment within our tiny ego world. Jung tells us that our need to explore our unconscious and our need for a religious life are the same need. That which we seek manifests as a symbol. It surges out of the deep layers of the psyche as what was anciently named the imago Dei, the God image. In former times, Western people experienced the God image through mystical contemplation, symbolic ritual, and religion. Our patriarchal society is dedicated to living the masculine side of human nature at the expense of the feminine and at the expense of wholeness. The one place where we are vulnerable, where our souls can break through our modern armor, is in our loves. Today we have taken the God image out of the temple and relocated it in our midst, in the relationship between two human beings. In the feeling of being caught up in some power that completely overwhelms us, of being in love, we rediscover our religious life. This is why men and women put such impossible demands on each other. We actually believe unconsciously that this mortal being has the responsibility for making our lives whole, keeping us happy, making our lives meaningful, intense, and ecstatic. As we continue our journey with Tristan and Isolde, we will see with greater clarity how we have mixed our spiritual aspiration with our human relationships. In our journey, we meet many aspects of the inner feminine. we have met Blanche Fleur, who symbolizes the fate of the feminine in our patriarchal world. Now comes Isolde the Fair, part sorceress and part ordinary woman, part human and part divine. She is the inner ideal of the eternal feminine, an image of beauty and perfection that inspires man to a sense of meaning in life. Carl Jung called this aspect of our psyche the anima. Anima means soul in Latin, for it personifies that part of the psyche that we have always called the soul. The feminine principle within a man is above all a principle of relatedness. But anima delivers a man over to a special kind of relatedness. She personifies a man's capacity to relate to his own inner self, to the realm of the unconscious. Women have an equivalent psychological structure, which Jung called the animus. Women relate to their animus side differently than men relate to anima. But there is one thing that men and women have in common. Romantic love always consists in the projection of the soul image. One of our peculiar developments in our Western world is that we no longer have any sense of having a soul. It's a word that philosophers, theologians, and poets use, but we don't know why, and we secretly doubt that they know either. Jung's psychology leads us back to the soul as a concrete reality, capable of being known, described, and experienced with immediacy. It is through the soul that we find the unconscious, the inner life, the side that is beyond ego. There are 3 things Jung said about the soul that can help us in our journey with Tristan and Isolde. First, the soul is not a figure of speech or a superstition. The soul is a psychological reality. It is that part of the unconscious that is outside the ego, yet mediates the unconscious to the ego. Jung said that the soul is both receiver and transmitter, receiving images from the unconscious and transmitting them to the conscious ego mind. Second, the soul manifests itself and the unconscious by means of symbols. Images that flow from the unconscious in the form of dream, vision, fantasy, and all forms of imagination. The vital thing that Jung discovered for us is that we have lost our sense of soul because we have lost our respect for symbols. Our modern mind has been trained that symbols are illusion. Third, for men, the symbol of the soul is the image of woman. If a man is aware of this, he can learn to relate to that image as symbol and to live his soul inwardly. Until a man learns to confront the motives, desires, and unlived possibilities of his inner self, he can never be genuinely fulfilled, for ultimate meaning must be found within. We know that romantic love, in its origins as courtly love, was conceived of as a spiritual discipline. Now it will serve us to learn how the cult of courtly love had its roots in religion. For many centuries after the advent of the Christian era, people continued to worship their old gods and goddesses, mixing their pagan religious practices with Christian worship. Many of the attitudes and beliefs of the old religions were suppressed as heresy, but live on in us and in our culture unconsciously. And they live on for a reason. They correspond to a psychological need and reality within human beings that are served neither by orthodoxy nor by the official viewpoints. One of the most powerful of the early religions was the Manichaean movement. In Europe, this became Catharism, for the believers called themselves Cathars, meaning pure. By the 12th century, this movement was very strong in the south of France and in the courts of Europe. In France, it was called the Albigensian heresy because it was centered in the city of Albi in France. They believed that true love was the worship of a feminine savior, a mediator between God and man, who waited in the sky to welcome the pure into the realm of light. By contrast, ordinary human sexuality and marriage were bestial and unspiritual. Cathars believed that the love of man for woman should be an earthly allegory of their spiritual love for the Queen of Heaven. Many Christians saw Catharism as a reform movement, The patriarchal church of the Middle Ages had become materialistic and dogmatic. It offered a collective experience of ritual and teachings in which ordinary people found no room for a personal experience of a living God. By contrast, the Cathars offered an experience of God that was at once personal, individual, and lyrical. They returned the feminine to religion. The Cathars believed that the world of the spirit was good, while the physical world was evil. Salvation came through physical death and the intervention of the feminine Savior. Therefore, in preparation for this freedom from the flesh, women were adored as symbols of the other world. Catharism was declared a heresy and driven underground. Like every powerful idea that is suppressed, it reappeared in another form, the cult of courtly love. That cult began a revolution in our attitudes toward the feminine values of love, relationship, spiritual experience, and the pursuit of beauty. That revolution finally matured into what we call Romanticism. In revolutionizing our attitudes toward women, it left a strange split in our feelings. Western man finds it difficult to stop looking on woman as a symbol and to simply see her as a woman, as a human being. He is caught in the ambivalence he feels towards his own inner feminine, sometimes rushing towards it in search of his lost soul, sometimes disdaining it as a needless complication in his life. This is the unhealed split within man that he projects onto woman, the war he fights at her expense. At the beginning, when it was still a spiritual ideal, courtly love did not permit sexuality or marriage between the lovers. By contrast, we always mix romance with sex and marriage. We have inherited the unconscious belief that true love must be a mutual adoration of such intensity that all of heaven and earth is revealed in our love. But unlike our courtly ancestors, we try to mix that worship into our personal lives. On one hand, we want stability and relationship with another human being. On the other hand, we unconsciously demand someone who will move us to a state of adoration and fill our lives with ecstasy. Here we find, still living within us, the Catharist fantasy, the religious ideal in disguise. Romantic love is the most magnificent fantasy in the mind of Western man. But it is not an illusion. All fantasy is reality, reality expressed in symbol. Catharism is the fantasy of finding one's lost soul. It is the wondrous fantasy of discovering that the inner world is real, the soul is real, the gods are real, and that we can find that world. The truth behind the fantasy has to be earned. We must give up trying to live the fantasy of romantic love with mortal people in the temporal world, and instead live the truth of it as an inner event, experienced in the timeless realm of the soul. The first time Tristan goes to Iseult, it is for healing. As soon as this is accomplished, he returns to Cornwall. There King Mark is content to rule without a queen, and he and his nephew return to their world of masculine pastimes. When Tristan returns to Ireland, it is for the purpose of using Iseult as a pawn in his competition with the barons. In his attitude toward Iseult, we see the Western man's attitude toward his soul. When we are so wounded that nothing else will work, we will reluctantly go to our souls. We will finally explore our inner domains and look for the meaning of our lives. But once we have gone there and found healing, we instantly refocus on our patriarchal ego lives. King Mark's refusal to marry is a symbol of the desire to maintain the patriarchal status quo, a sign that something is amiss in the Western male psyche. Not only has the feminine been lost, he's not even aware of its absence. We have come to see the soul as an unnecessary complication in a neat and tidy masculine world. It is the felon barons who challenge this state of affairs, for it is always something that we see as bad in our lives that forces us toward wholeness. It may be illness, exhaustion from overwork, a neuroses that suddenly wells up and disrupts our lives, forcing us to look for the meaning behind what we can't explain. When our lives go sterile, we go looking for anima. But we want her on our own terms. We want anima to energize us, to give us a sense of meaning and direction, and to make our lives more exciting. But we don't want to learn from her. We want to use her, as Tristan uses Isolde as a pawn of statecraft, deceiving her to do so. When Tristan deceives Isolde about his motives for seeking her out, he believes that he lies. He does not know that underneath his conscious motives, his unconscious draws him inexorably toward her. Tristan does not know what it is that he seeks. His deceit works, and he wins Isolde for King Mark. But force and guile do not work in the end. Tristan believes he has conquered the feminine, but it is he who will be conquered.
King Mark was amazed when he saw his new queen, for she was the fairest maiden ever seen in that land. But on the wedding night, Isolde sent her maid to the king's bed in her place, and cast a spell to deceive the king. Thus, the king never knew that his queen had lost her maidenhood in the arms of Tristan. And Tristan and Isolde burned with a fire that would not be contained. Heedless of danger, they met in secret and took their fill of passion. Often they met in the garden behind the palace, and when morning came and they had to part, Isolde would say, "O Tristan, surely this is the enchanted orchard of which the harpers sing." But Tristan said, "No, this is not the enchanted orchard, but one day we shall go together to a fortunate land from which none returns. There rises a castle of white marble. At each of its 1,000 windows burns a lighted candle. At each a minstrel plays and sings a melody without end. The sun does not shine there, but none regrets its light. It is the happy land of the living." But finally they were caught, and the king raged like a wounded boar and sent them to the stake to be burned. On the way to the stake, Tristan was allowed to stop and pray in a small chantry on the cliffs overlooking the sea. Once there, he said to himself, "Rather will I jump from this cliff than go in shame to the stake." And he threw himself from the window and over a cliff. But a strong wind caught his cloak, the breath of God slowed his fall, and he landed safe on the sands of the seashore. Then he went to find Isolde, and seizing her, escaped into the wild forest of Moreau. For 3 years the lovers lived in the wild wood. They lived on roots and herbs. They grew thin, and their clothes were ragged. But the love potion coursed in their blood, and they did not know that they suffered. One day they happened on the hermit Orgrin, a holy man, who said, "God aid you, Lord Tristan, for you have lost both this world and the next. Give back the queen to the man who espoused her lawfully, according to the laws of Rome." But Tristan answered, "And of what crime am I guilty? Do you know what cup it was we drank upon the high sea? That great draught inebriates us both." And Isolde said, "He does not love me, nor I him. It was because of an herb potion of which I drank, and he drank too." Soon after, a woodsman found their hut and led the king to them. He approached them with his sword. But when he came upon the lovers, they lay asleep on the ground, fully clothed, with Tristan's naked sword between them. And the king said to himself, "Does not the world know that a naked sword separating 2 bodies is the proof of chastity? If they loved each other with a mad love, would they lie here so purely?" Then he took a ring from his hand and put it on Isolde's finger, and taking Tristan's sword from the ground, he thrust his own in its place. When the lovers woke and found the ring and sword, for the first time they began to have second thoughts about what they had done, and how they had caused each other to give up their privileged lives for a savage existence. And so they came to decide that Isolde should return to the king. But Tristan said, "Queen, whatever may happen, and wherever I shall go, I shall be only yours, for I will serve only a single love." On the day that Tristan returned Isolde, the lovers sat together and wept. Before they went to meet the king, they made vows to one another. "Queen," said Tristan, "wherever I go, I will send you messengers. And should you ask, I shall come, no matter how far away." And Isolde gave Tristan a green jasper ring, and said, "If anyone comes who will show me this ring, there is no power that can prevent me from doing what you bid." And so Isolde was returned to King Mark. All the people rejoiced, and once again the land was happy. But Tristan left Cornwall in sorrow, for apart the lovers could neither live nor die, for their love was life and death together. So Tristan fled his sorrow through seas and islands and many lands.
When Isolde weds King Mark of Cornwall, Anima is returned to the inner kingdom. Feminine and masculine are joined. The self is completed and made whole. When Tristan betrays the king and destroys the marriage, he destroys the kingdom. The source of all the conflicts, confusions, and sufferings in the myth of Tristan and Isolde is due to one thing: Tristan's demand that he possess Isolde for himself. She who should be queen for a whole kingdom is stolen away by an individual. Ego usurps that which belongs to the self. The way that we pull Anima away from her role as queen of the inner world is by our attempt to make her into an external, physical woman. We do this by projection. This is our ego's way of trying to possess Anima. We demand of women that they be goddesses rather than human beings. By humanizing Anima, we lose sight of our souls. By trying to make women divine, we lose sight of their humanity and rob them of their womanhood. Our story tells us that the inner feminine must reign in the inner world. If we try to draw her away from the inner king, to extrovert her into our physical relationships, the kingdom is torn apart, and the structure of human life and human relationships is damaged. Tristan knows in his deepest heart that Isolde must always be the queen. That is why he never tries to make an ordinary marriage with her. That is why, at a crucial moment, he places the naked sword between himself and Isolde. He knows he cannot truly possess her in a personal and physical way. He relinquishes her to the king with one hand, even as he tries to possess her with the other. If he could relinquish her completely and understand why this must be so, Tristan's story would not be tragic. He could stay close by Isolde and experience her as the goddess she is. He would have his soul as an inner reality and be free to live with a mortal woman, to love her in her own right, as is her due. When Tristan and Isolde tell the holy man, Orgren, that the magic potion is the cause of their love, a new morality enters the world. Those who drink of the love potion claim a special dispensation. Inebriated by the magic wine, Tristan is lifted above the old standards of right and wrong. He will not be judged by any rule, save the law of passion. And God intervenes on his side so many times that he seems rightfully to claim the sanction of heaven. At several key points in the story, the lovers are saved by a miracle. What do these miracles mean? They're not mere dramatic devices. They tell us that the lovers do right even as they seem to do wrong. The other world intervenes over and over into ordinary life to relieve them of the normal consequences of their acts. This world, the enchanted orchard of which the lovers speak, is the inner world of the psyche, the unexplored part of a human being outside time and space. When the love potion seizes Tristan and Isolde, it is not only asking of them that they add a new dimension to their lives. It demands that they obliterate all the standards of loyalty, commitment, and faithfulness by which we ordinary mortals keep our lives and relationships intact. Since the ascendancy of romantic love, most Westerners are torn constantly between two opposing ideals. One is the ideal of romance. The other is the ideal of commitment in human relationships. We commonly think they are the same, but they are utterly opposed. With courtly love, a whole new set of values came into our culture. Romance, in its purest form, seeks only one thing: passion. It is willing to sacrifice everything, duty, obligation, relationship, and commitment, for passion. Our ideal of romance teaches us that we must find the enchanted orchard by the one means known to us: falling in love. We believe that we have the right to follow our projections wherever they may lead, and to pursue passion for its own sake, regardless of the relationships that are broken and the people who are hurt. Passion has become unconsciously defined as our highest good, and all other values are sacrificed to it. This is the morality that envelops Tristan. The only voice we hear raised in objection is that of the holy man, Oregon. We are tempted to laugh and dismiss his warning voice as the hopelessly naive, old-fashioned morality of a bygone era. But behind every ideal of morality is something worth looking at: a set of human values. Those values are not fabricated out of thin air. They come from somewhere in the depths of the human psyche and answer to genuine human needs. Underneath his quaint words, the old hermit pleads for the qualities of loyalty and commitment, for he knows that Tristan and Isolde have given up all loyalty, all commitment, all duty save one: their dedication to passion. But a commitment to passion is not a substitute for commitment to a human being. In our culture, we have these two feelings completely confused. We are all committed to finding passion, and we imagine that this is the same thing as being committed to a person. But passion fades, then migrates to someone else. Loyalty and commitment are archetypes in our human structure. They are as necessary to us as food and air. It is out of this profound human need for stable, loyal, and enduring relationships that the morality of commitment grows. We assume that the single ingredient we need for relationship, the one thing it cannot do without, is romance. But in fact, the essential ingredients for relationship are affection and commitment. A man is committed to a woman only when he can inwardly affirm that he binds himself to her as an individual, and that he will be with her even when he and she are no longer afire with passion. When a man can say this inwardly and mean it, then he has touched the essence of commitment. But the new morality of romance is deeply ingrained within us, for the truth hidden in that morality is the truth of the inner world, the true enchanted orchard which must be lived inwardly. The morality of human commitment, on the other hand, is to be lived outwardly, on the level of our relationships with other people. To separate these two moralities and to live without betraying our relationships is the most difficult task of consciousness that we can undertake in our modern Western world. It is no accident that the spell of the love potion lasts for 3 years, or that Tristan and Isolde leave the forest in the 4th year. 4 is a symbol of wholeness, unity, and completion. In dreams and myths, the occurrence of 4 shows that the psyche is moving toward a synthesis, or that an evolution is drawing toward completion. A new beginning is at hand. By contrast, 3 is the symbol of incompleteness, the stage in which we are not conscious of ourselves as a totality. 3 becomes 4 by the addition of the missing part of our lives, and 4 can become 1, the consciousness of our wholeness and individuality. For 3 years, Tristan and Isolde abide in the forest of Marot under a spell, believing it to be the enchanted orchard. Then in the 4th year, the spell begins to wane. King Mark appears to call them back to ordinary life. Every man, when he falls in love, escapes into the forest of Marot. He focuses his whole being on his fantasy of romance. But inevitably comes the moment, in the fullness of time, when the spell is broken. This is the point where a man has, for the first time, a chance to graduate beyond his projections and into relationship. He has the opportunity to learn that his projections are really part of himself, potentialities within him that he has never touched because he has always tried to live them through a woman. This withdrawal of romantic projections gives him the power to see woman as she really is, rather than as the carrier of his lost soul and unlived life. It opens the possibility of relating to a woman as an individual, as an equal, in all her strengths and gifts, so different from his own, and yet so necessary for his world. Strangely, most men react to this stage of romantic love as though it were a great misfortune. When a man's projections on a woman unexpectedly evaporate, he acts as though she has done something wrong. If he would open his eyes, he would see that this is a golden opportunity to discover the real person who is there. It is equally the chance to discover the unknown parts of himself that he has been projecting on her and trying to live through her. But modern Western man is so accustomed to the patterns of romantic love that the prospect of giving them up seems a disaster. He feels that all the joy and intensity of life are contained in the hope that one day a woman will come along who will make him whole and make life perfect. The issue is equally difficult for women. Our culture trains women that their role is not to be human beings, but mirrors who reflect back to a man his ideal or his fantasy. There is something appealing about being worshipped as a goddess, but it enacts a heavy price. For when the projections vanish, there is no relationship to take its place. Projections are a law unto themselves. We can manipulate them and keep them alive for a certain time, but there's always a point at which the projections lift. It is at this point in our evolution where our possibilities are richest that most people miss their opportunity. When a man graduates out of the forest of Marot, it opens up a whole new world for him. He discovers he can't make woman the carrier of his unlived life, that there are things he must do for himself. He must have an inner life. He must serve values that have meaning for him. He must have interests and enthusiasms that well out of his own soul. This is the naked sword that Tristan places between him and Iseult. It is the consciousness of his own individuality, of his own life distinct from woman. An awesome potential is at stake in this evolution. It is the potential for being fully individual while also relating genuinely to a human being. For when a man awakens to the unexpected complexity of individual self, he becomes capable of relating directly to a woman in her individuality. The test of true individuation is that it includes the capacity to relate to other people as individuals. Our desperate need is to realize that we need both individuality and a relationship to a particular person. No man can be fully an individual unless he is fully related, and his capacity for genuine relatedness grows as he becomes a complete individual. This, then, is the great evolution that becomes possible in the 4th year of Marot, the potential for making a synthesis between individuality and relationship, and living them in the unity of one human life. Tristan is called upon to sacrifice his projections, his way of approaching anima, and his way of approaching woman. If he could make that sacrifice, his soul would be returned to him as an inner experience, and he would find that there is another Iseult, a mortal woman waiting for him. But Tristan fails his sacrifice. He makes secret arrangements with Iseult to keep their relationship on the same level of intrigue and betrayal. If he would make a clean sacrifice, he could elevate his relationship with Iseult to a new level, but he renounces the sacrifice. The symbol of his failure is the ring of green jasper. We shall soon see what terrible tricks that green jasper ring will play before our story is ended.
Quitting Iseult and the land of Cornwall, Tristan wandered afar in wars and adventures, lonely and in sorrow. One day, riding into Brittany, he saw the land wasted, the towns deserted, and the farms burned. He learned that King Hol was under siege in his castle, and his vassal, Count Riel, was laying waste the land. So Tristan went to the castle to offer the king his aid, and the king's son, Cahirdan, received Tristan with honor and showed him all the castle. In the women's room, Cahirdan's mother and sister sat together weaving, and Cahirdan said, "This is my sister Iseult of the white hands." And Tristan was first startled, then smiled at her gently. Cahirdan and Tristan rode out every day to ambush Riel's troops and bring back food and arms, and a deep love grew between them. One day, Count Riel assaulted the castle with a great army, but Tristan and Cahirdan led their knights against him. Tristan rode at the count and fought him until he cried mercy, and Riel surrendered and called off his army. Now Cahirdan said to his father, "Let Tristan marry my sister," and it was done. And Tristan forgot his sorrows and was alive again, for he loved Iseult of the white hands for her goodness and beauty. But on the wedding night, as his valets undressed him, the green jasper ring fell from his hand to the floor, and Tristan remembered Iseult the fair, and his sorrow returned. In the bridal bed, Tristan lay cold as a stone and could not bring himself to touch his bride. When she asked him what was wrong, he told her that once, when gravely wounded, he had made a vow to heaven that if he were healed, he would be chaste for 1 year after marrying. As time passed, Iseult of the white hands told Cahirdan of Tristan's vow, and Cahirdan came to Tristan in wrath, saying that he had done Iseult dishonor. Then Tristan told Cahirdan the truth about Iseult the fair and the love potion. Cahirdan thought about Tristan's story for 3 days. Then he told Tristan of his plan. They would travel to Cornwall to Iseult and learn whether she still loved Tristan. If not, he would live in peace with Iseult of the white hands. And so they traveled to Cornwall. But Queen Iseult, having heard of Tristan's marriage, would not see him, and so he and Cahirdan returned to Brittany. There, Tristan felt such pain and unhappiness that he resolved to return to Cornwall alone. Making his way by subterfuge into her chambers, he showed her the jasper ring, and she fell into his arms. For 3 days he lingered until the guards grew suspicious. Finally he said, "Iseult, I must go." And she said, "Oh, fold your arms around me and strain me so that our souls may go free at last. Take me to that happy place of which you told me long ago." And Tristan said, "I will take you to the palace of the living, Queen, for the time is near." Returning to Brittany, Tristan lived apart from his wife without joy or comfort. Then one day, riding into battle, he was ambushed and pierced with a poisoned spear. Calling Cahirdan, he said, "Take this ring to Iseult the fair, and say if she does not come, I die. Say she must come, for we drank our death together, and to remember the oath I swore to serve a single love, for I have kept that oath." Now this was the signal they agreed on. If Cahirdan returned with Iseult the fair, he should show a white sail, but if she refused to come, then a black sail. But Iseult of the white hands listened at the door, and for the first time understood why her husband had rejected her, and from that day on she vowed revenge. Cahirdan sailed to Cornwall and showed Iseult the jasper ring. She quit the castle and secretly boarded Cahirdan's ship. Each day Tristan lay on his pallet and asked his wife if she saw the ship returning. One day she saw it, its white sail billowing in the wind, and she said to Tristan, "My lord, the ship is in sight." "What color is the sail?" asked Tristan. "Why, it is black," she answered. In her hurtness, Iseult of the white hands gave vent to her spite in this manner. Then Tristan turned to the wall, and speaking Iseult's name 4 times, he died. When Iseult the fair set foot upon the land, she heard mourning in the streets, and she learned of Tristan's death. So she came to him and lay down beside him, and kissed his mouth and face. She clasped him closely, and so gave up her soul, and died of grief for her lover. King Mark brought them home to Cornwall and made them each a fine tomb to the left and right of a chantry. One night, a briar bush sprang from Tristan's tomb and climbed over the chantry. It descended to root close to Isolt's tomb, and for many years it endured, strong and lovely and fragrant.
There are several paradoxes in the last portion of our story. The first is Tristan's rejection of Iseult of the White Hands. Why does he reject the woman he lives with to die of longing for a goddess whom he can never truly possess in this physical life? Humanly, this makes no sense. Yet most men follow Tristan's pattern. When a flesh and blood mortal human appears in a man's life who offers him love and relatedness, he ends up rejecting her because she can't measure up to the ideal who can only live in his mind. The second grand puzzle in our story is this. What is this love that exists between Tristan and Iseult the Fair? Even we Western romantics must at this point begin to wonder at the blatant egocentricity that they visit on each other in the name of love. What kind of love is Tristan's in wanting to keep Iseult tied to him even though she's married to King Mark? What kind of love makes Iseult want Tristan to have no wife, no home, no children? Love is a feeling that is directed at another human being, not at one's own passion. Love desires the well-being and happiness of one's beloved, not a grand drama at the expense of the other person. Our story shows us that the greatest paradox is romantic love itself, for it is an unholy muddle of two holy loves. One is divine, the natural urge toward the inner world. The other is human love, our love of people. Both of these are valid and necessary, but our culture has them mixed up in romantic love and nearly lost them both. At its best, romanticism is an attempt to restore to Western consciousness the divine side of life, the inner life, the power of imagination, myth, dream, and vision. The tragedy of Tristan shows us that when we misplace divine love, we destroy our human relationships. Our task is to learn how to honor both of the worlds contained in romantic love, the divine world of Iseult the Fair and the human world of Iseult of the White Hands. Despite all the adventures they pass through together, Tristan never makes a human relationship to Iseult the Fair. This is one of the great paradoxes in romantic love. People never seem to settle into relationship with each other as flesh and blood human beings until they are out of the romantic love stage, until they love each other instead of being in love. When Tristan departs Cornwall, leaving Iseult with King Mark, he falls into despair. In his ego's view, life has no meaning, yet fate draws him on toward life itself. For Iseult of the White Hands is the incarnation of human life. Here is the core of the true tragedy of our story. It is not Tristan's death, for all men die. Tristan's tragedy is that he refuses to live while he is yet alive. When he rejects Iseult of the White Hands, he rejects the earth and all that comes with this human life, human love, relatedness, all of earth's joys. Iseult of the White Hands personifies another aspect of the feminine. Her white hands are fair and delicate, yet skilled in the practical work of life. When we meet her, she's weaving, for she delights in the ordinary human and earthly life. We call this side of the feminine the earth feminine. She personifies the capacity within each man for seeing the beauty, the value, and the sacredness in the physical world, in the physical life, and in ordinary humanness. The earth feminine relates us to flesh and blood women and men. Everything that Iseult of the White Hands does shows us that her one concern is relatedness. She does not ask to be taken to the enchanted orchard. Rather, she asks Tristan to love her and make a life with her in the here and now. By contrast, Iseult the Fair is a goddess, half divine, half person. She is that aspect of the feminine who can only be truly experienced on the level of the symbolic and imaginal. Anima's desire is to take us to the inner world, the boundless reaches of the unconscious. But the earth feminine directs us to the finite personal world of human relationship, that which is bounded by commitment, affection, and relatedness to an individual. There is only one time when Tristan begins to live again. When he draws near to Iseult of the White Hands, he forgets his strange pact with death. He finds a wife, a home, a family. Why does he reject all this? Lying on his deathbed, when he gives the jasper ring to Cahirdan, he tells us why. Say she must come, and to remember the oath I swore to serve a single love, for I have kept that oath. This mistaken ideal underlies the whole tragedy of romantic love. The single love is the divine love of anima. But there are two loves, human and divine. The great flaw in romantic love is that it seeks one love, but forgets the other. Romantic love attempts to balance the one-sidedness of our Western psyche by restoring the experience of the gods, the inner world, the mysteries, and the divine love. But instead, it embraces the opposite polarity. It idealizes the divine and ecstatic world, but leaves no room for ordinary humanness. When Tristan refuses to consummate his marriage, it means that he rejects human relationship in favor of a passionate vision. We can see something like this in modern marriages and relationships. There is a provisional quality in most relationships. Each of us secretly reserves the right to break his or her commitment if a passionate vision should happen to be projected on another person. For a man to love in the way of the earth feminine means for him to be related to a human being in her totality, including her imperfections. Being in love is not directed at a woman. It is directed at an ideal. This explains why the love between Tristan and Iseult the Fair is so egocentric. Neither of them is concerned with the happiness of the other. They are concerned only in furthering their state of passion. In the end, they want to use each other to break free from the ordinary earth, to that magical, enchanted world. There are two marriages that Tristan needs to make. The first marriage is with his own soul, is made by going to the inner world, practicing his religion, his inner work. The second marriage is to Iseult of the White Hands, a union with another human being, and by extension with a community of other human beings. These marriages reflect the two natures within us, the human and the divine. Christ is the ultimate Western symbol of our two natures in synthesis. He is God in human form. The implications of this belief, taken as symbol, are enormous. It means that this physical world, this physical body, and this life we lead on earth are also holy. There is a statement in Zen, "This earth, that is the way." The way to enlightenment, to soul, is not by denying this earth. It is found within this mortal life. The doctrine of incarnation shows us that the divine world and the human world coexist within each human being. It is when the two natures live together in conscious synthesis that a person becomes a conscious self. We need to see the awesome implications of God become man as a symbol, as an archetypal model deep in the Western unconscious. It is a psychological reality, a unifying principle that acts on us from within, whether we are conscious of it or not. We are going to live this dual nature in one way or another, either consciously or unconsciously. Western psychological history is this. As we cease to take seriously the incarnation, even as symbolic reality, the truth of our dual nature goes underground. Unconsciously, divine love finds its expression in romantic love. Romantic idealism teaches us that we should serve only the divine love, that ordinary human beings are not worthy of our love. Because Tristan chooses to serve only this single divine love, his tragedy is one of lost opportunity. He misses his chance to discover that there are two loves, the divine love of the inner world and the human love in the physical world. He never learns that the meaning of life is made up of two things: seeking his inner ideal and living a human life with a physical woman. It is no coincidence that all romantic literature from Tristan and Isolde to the present is filled with suffering and death. Suffering seems to be an inseparable part of romance. Even our word passion originally meant to suffer. Many of the archetypal lovers, like Romeo and Juliet, choose to die together rather than live alone. What is this idealism that chooses death and the hope of another world rather than accept a less perfect life on earth? When the jasper ring falls from Tristan's finger on his wedding night, it signifies the final great turning point in his life. In that moment, he gives up his wife and life itself, and from then on he seems only to wait for death. Had we looked, we could have seen death approaching very early in our story. We can hear the longing for death in Tristan's promise to Isolde. One day we shall go together to a fortunate land from which none returns. There rises a castle of white marble. At each of its 1,000 windows burns a lighted candle. At each a minstrel plays and sings a melody without end. Indeed, they drank their death together with a love potion. And as the end of our story approaches, death seems to be the object of all their longing. Tristan and Isolde's despair on earth is made bearable only by the perfection, beauty, and happiness of the world to come. But what is this land of the white marble castle? This perfect and beautiful realm can only be the inner world. But why is this inner world of souls symbolized by death? From primordial times, death has been conceived as freedom from the physical realm of time and space into the unlimited universe of spirit and eternity. This liberation from the physical is, for the unconscious, a symbol of something more subtle, the liberation of ego from the bounds of its tiny world into the vast inner universe of the psyche. The land of death is the inner world of the soul. The deepest meaning of death, experienced in the depths of the unconscious, is as a symbol of transformation. This is what is symbolized over and over in the great tales of romance, using death as a symbol. This is the one solution to the terrible sufferings of romance, a change of consciousness and a change of values. The death within the transformative experience is the death of ego. When a new set of values comes into life and a new synthesis becomes possible, it must destroy the old world order of ego. In Tristan's day, they took the symbol literally. They believed that they would only find the world of soul and spirit by actual physical death. In fact, the Cathars and troubadours openly stated that they were seeking physical transformation through passionate love and death. Death because it released them from the slavery of the flesh. Passion because in the intensity of its ecstasy and suffering, they saw a foretaste of the divine world. Romantic love was for them an initiation. The passion of love was thought to spiritualize the elect in anticipation of the final passion. In Tristan's time, most men thought of soul and spirit as quasi-physical entities, only slightly more subtle than the physical body. They had to be located in a literal physical body or place. They thought of heaven as an actual physical place rather than a state of being, and they spent centuries speculating over its location in the universe. Many modern Western men no longer believe in the physical reality of heaven, but we still walk through life longing for a transfiguring experience, a vision that will give our lives meaning and wholeness. We are searching for our souls, for the divine world, but we don't know how to experience it inwardly. Unconsciously, we seek it in passion, falling in love, delivering ourselves over to a power that envelops and possesses us. It is ecstasy, it is suffering, it is a kind of death. But most of all, it is a taste of what used to be sought in the afterlife, transfiguration. It is death and rebirth. One is dead to the world and alive to a realm that is bigger than life. As long as the passion lasts, this is what one feels. And this, above all, is what one seeks. Although we may no longer believe in heaven, Western people still unconsciously separate the spiritual and the physical world. We really don't believe that we can experience our gods in our spiritual lives as an inner reality while pursuing our ordinary daily lives on earth. It's hard for us to think of those two worlds, inner and outer, coexisting simultaneously in one human being. This is why we always try to embody the divine world in something or someone outside ourselves. In fact, most Westerners simply don't believe in the inner world. Therefore, whatever we do with that unlived side of ourselves has to be unconscious, has to be projected out into the physical world. The fact of a non-physical inner world is a difficult idea for Western people. We talk of soul and spirit, but we really don't believe in them. Over the centuries, we have lost contact with the inner life in its symbolism, as our culture has turned ever more literal and materialistic. Now we begin to see that the death we seek in romantic love is transformation. The suffering of romance is ultimately no different than the suffering of mysticism and religion. It is the pain shared by all mortals who would give birth to the divine world within their own lives. Suffering is the inevitable path that must be trod on the way to consciousness, the inevitable price for the transformation we seek. But we only transform when we experience our suffering consciously and voluntarily. Unconscious suffering leads nowhere. This is why romance often seems to be a meaningless cycle. When we don't find the divine world in another human being, we fall into despair. To suffer consciously means to live through the death of ego, voluntarily to withdraw one's projections from other people, to stop seeking for the divine world in others, and instead to find one's own inner life as a psychological and religious act. It means to take responsibility for discovering one's totality, to question one's old patterns, to be willing to change. All of this involves conflict, self-questioning, uncovering self-deceptions we would rather not face. It's painful and difficult. But this suffering leads us to our totality. It is a path to the divine world. The wonder that it is finally revealed is that we can live in the divine world even while we live here on earth. Deep within each of us rises a castle of white marble. To find that wondrous palace, we must look neither to another person nor to the other side of the grave, but within ourselves. At its best, romantic love leads us to the symbolic life. It opens our eyes to the meaning of human love. At its worst, it becomes a cycle of illusion. Most Westerners believe that the inner spiritual world is an illusion, that only the physical world is real. But the inner world is as true and real as the outer world, and illusion is a distorted relationship between them. We give birth to illusion when we project our inner world of images, of fantasy, on the external world. The soul of a human being is designed to enable him or her to see a different side of the cosmos. Its nature is to lead us toward the infinite, the archetypal. Anima's role is to create the fantasy side of life, based on the universal motifs that transcend our personal lives, yet are common to all of us. It is this function of the soul that tries to pull relationship toward the infinite, to convert human marriage into a huge, sweeping archetypal drama. We have not sought our souls and our gods consciously, but our souls have found us and snared us through our illusions. If a man would evolve out of illusion and pull the illusion out of his loves, there is one direct act of the will required. He must provide a place for anima on another level in his life. Western man must affirm his religious nature. He must accept that the images and feeling that flow out of him in dreams, fantasy, and imagination are the stuff of the divine realm, a separate order of reality distinct from his physical life, but equally real and important. He must be willing to see these images as inhabitants of a spiritual realm that his soul transmits to him in symbol. One may do this by traditional religious practice, by contemplative meditation, by yoga, by fantasy and dream work, or by Jung's active imagination. But it requires an inner practice, an affirmative soul life actually lived day by day. If a man does this, he begins to learn the difference between the inner and outer life, between what must be lived symbolically and what must be lived physically. This is the evolution and the consciousness that comes to the man who will pay the price for this change. He learns what it is to be a mortal man with an immortal soul. The story of Tristan and Isolde shows us what has happened to us as a culture and as individuals. But the myth leaves us in a quandary. It tells us what is, but not what to do about it. Another myth from the tradition of the Native American can help us find a solution to our dilemma. It's the story of the white bison spirit woman, a myth of the Oglala Sioux Nation, recounted by the great medicine man, Black Elk. 2 scouts were out looking for bison. When they came to the top of a high hill, they saw something coming a long way off. And when it came closer, they cried out, "It's a woman!" Then the foolish scout had bad thoughts and spoke them. But the other said, "That is a sacred woman. Throw all bad thoughts away." When she came closer, they saw that she was very beautiful. And she said, "If you want to do as you think, you may come." And the foolish one went, and a white cloud came and covered them, and when it blew away, the foolish man was a skeleton covered with worms. Then the woman spoke to the other scout. "Go home and tell your people that a big teepee shall be built for me in the center of the nation." And the scout went, and the people did as they were told. The woman came to the teepee and gave something to the chief, and it was a pipe with a bison calf carved on one side and 12 eagle feathers hanging from the stem and tied with the grass that never breaks. "Behold," she said, "with this you shall multiply and be a good nation. Nothing but good shall come of it." Then she went out of the teepee, and then it was a white bison galloping away, and soon it was gone. Anima is a sacred woman. If we treat her as a sacred being, then she brings the medicine pipe, our means of knowing the other world. If we are like the foolish scout and fail to treat her as a sacred being, but as a physical person, the price we pay is not only the loss of the other world, but the loss of our human life. But when we approach Anima as a divine presence in the inner world, what blessings she bestows! The gift she brings is the sacred world, the restoration of the sacred in our lives. So much of our lives is spent in a longing and a search for what we do not know. So many of the material things we want turn out to be symbols for the actual values and qualities for which we hunger. Without realizing it, we are searching for the sacred. Like a river of being in which all the streams of inner life run together, all the values that we feel instinctively as sacred converge in the image of Anima and are made conscious in us through her. White Bison Woman comes to the 2 scouts as a stranger from a larger world outside the ego's vision. She is Anima, bringing to the conscious mind the evidence of realities not seen in the physical world. The symbol of the power to contact the other world is the medicine pipe. The 12 eagle feathers represent the sky and the 12 moons, and the power to know the totality of life. The number 12 combines the number 3, which stands for the limited physical world, and 4, which symbolizes the realm of the soul. 12 combines heaven and earth, the spiritual and the physical. The bison calf carved on the pipe tells us that the earth is an integral part of the sacred in our lives. Perhaps the deepest lesson that we learn from this myth is that it is up to us to recognize the sacred if we want to experience its power. The power of the white bison woman is manifested to the people only because the wise scout sees that she is sacred. The sacred is always there in our lives, but it takes on the power to fill our lives with meaning only when we open our eyes to it. This is one of the great mysteries. It is our consciousness that has the power to make the sacred exist in us. To build a teepee in the midst of the nation means to make a place for the sacred in the center of our lives. It means to devote time and energy to experiencing our psyches, to exploring our unconscious. The first thing required of a Western man is to acknowledge that the sacred world exists. Then he has to spend time and energy learning to experience it. Dr. Jung used to return a patient to his ancestral religion as quickly as possible if that person could do it. If that way is open to a man or woman, it's the simplest way to experience the sacred. But for many people, this is not possible. The ritual and symbols of external, culturally transmitted religion no longer have life for them. For such people, there are other ways. What is required is not so much an external collective religion, but an inner experience of the numinous, divine realm of the psyche. For such people, the religious life is found in the daily practice of meditation, symbolic ritual, active imagination. By such a life, we find our way back to the primordial ground from which all religion grew, the individual dreams, visions, and vivid encounters with the inner world. People become so wearied of the cycles of romance that they begin to wonder if there is such a thing as love. There is. Love is one of the absolute realities of human nature. It is an archetype of the collective unconscious, both eternal and universal in humankind. Love is distinct from ego. It is a force from within that enables the ego to look outside itself, to see other human beings as something to be valued and cherished rather than used. Love is not a doing, but a state of being, a connectedness, an identification with another mortal. Love is the power within us that affirms and values another human being as he or she is. Human love affirms the person who is actually there, not the ideal we want him or her to be. Love causes us to value a person as a total, individual self, and to accept the imperfections as well as the admirable qualities. Love alters our sense of importance. Through love, we see that the other individual has as great a value in the cosmos as our own. It becomes just as important to us that he or she should be whole, should live fully, should find the joy of life, as that our own needs be met. In the world of the unconscious, love is one of those great psychological forces that have the power to transform the ego. It is the one power that awakens the ego to the existence of something outside itself. Thus, love, by its very nature, is the exact opposite of egocentricity. It is distinct from our ego's desires and power plays. It leads in a different direction, toward the goodness, the value, and the needs of the people around us. In its very essence, love is an appreciation, a recognition of another's value. It moves us to honor other people, not use them. Romantic love, by contrast, is directed at our own projections, at our own expectations, our own fantasies. In a very real sense, it is a love not of another person, but of ourselves. The paradox is that we should love our projections, and we should love ourselves. The love of self is a true and valid love. The problem is how to love oneself without falling into egotism. Love of self is the ego's longing for the larger dimensions of the unconscious, its willingness to open itself to the other parts of our being. Love of self is then also divine love, our search for the ultimate meaning, for our souls. The fault in romantic love is that we love ourselves wrongly. When we fall in love with our projections, we don't see that it is our own selves we are searching for. Many years ago, a wise person had a name for human love. It was called stirring the oatmeal love. Stirring the oatmeal is a humble act, but it symbolizes a willingness to share ordinary human life, to find meaning in simple, unromantic tasks. To stir the oatmeal means to find the relatedness, the value, even the beauty in simple and ordinary things. It represents the discovery of the sacred in the midst of the humble and ordinary. Jung once said that feeling is a matter of the small. And in human love, we can see that this is true. The real relatedness between two people is experienced in the small tasks they do together, the conversation at the end of the day, the words of understanding, the daily companionship, the encouragement in times of difficulty, the small gift when least expected, the spontaneous gesture of love. When a couple are genuinely relating to each other, they are willing to enter into the whole spectrum of human life together. They transform even the unexciting, the difficult, and mundane things into a joyful and fulfilling part of life. This is the tragedy of Tristan. For in rejecting the earthly love of Iseult of the White Hands, he turns his back on life itself. In his pursuit of perfection, of the single love of his projections, he fails to see the human love waiting for him in this world. So a myth born in the 12th century speaks to us today. Here are the origins of the myth of romantic love that confuses so many of us. But here also is the solution to our confusion. We must make a place in our lives for both loves, both Iseults, or like Tristan, we may lose them both. Our story teaches us that we must evolve past the muddle of romantic love, that we must consciously make a place in our world for both the inner life and the human love of relatedness. Only then will we make the transformation into a new consciousness, and only then will we have lives that are fully lived.
The myth of Tristan and Iseult has been adapted mainly from the Bédier compilation of the turn of the century, translated into English by Hilaire Belloc and Paul Rosenfeld. The Forest of Moreau segment of the myth was taken from Bérulle, the first poet to tell the tale of Tristan. The myth of the white bison spirit woman is recounted in John Niehart's Black Elk Speaks. It has been condensed here. The music portion of the tape is from Richard Wagner's Prelude to Tristan and Iseult. We hope you've enjoyed this adaptation of Robert A. Johnson's popular book, We, Understanding the Psychology of Romantic Love. Look for Robert Johnson's books, He, She, We, Inner Work, and Ecstasy at your local bookstore.